Hello, this is Psych 92, Developmental Psychology, and now we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Middle Adulthood, Socio-Emotional Development. So one term that's very famous in our culture is the midlife crisis idea. And so that is the idea that when people are halfway through their lives, that they stop and look back at everything and maybe make drastic changes based on whether or not they're satisfied with their life status. So this was coined in 1978. And there was even a book about midlife, about having a midlife crisis. But interesting to know is that research does not support the idea of midlife crisis. People thought that, actually expected men and women who get into their 40s and 50s to experience it, but research doesn't support that it's a very common occurrence. So oftentimes it's not because people are reaching a certain age that they make this reevaluation. Often it's because of a triggering event, such as a major health crisis or the death of a loved one who's around the same age that might then make people reevaluate where they are. Stress occurs at every stage, right? There are different types, but in middle adulthood, a lot of times we have higher levels of stress than other components of our life. So when we call stress, that is actually a physical and psychological response that we experience after a threatening event. We'll talk about what entails a threatening event. So when we experience stress, our bodies react to it. It disrupts what we call homeostasis, right? It's that fight or flight syndrome kicks in when we're stressed out. What causes stress? Well, it could be major life events. Even positive events can cause stress. So when people are planning a wedding, that's a highly stressful event. When people have a baby or expand their family, those are generally positive events, but also increase stress levels. The more stress that people experience in a short period of time, the higher the risk of becoming sick, right? It's both psychological and physical. So Seeley came up with this idea of the general adaptation syndrome, that when people are undergoing a stressful event, there are three phases. So alarm is when you become aware that there is a threat and you mobilize your physiological resources. That's that fight or flight component, right? Where your adrenaline starts pumping, your eyes dilate, all these components, you feel the threat and your body responds. So resistance is the organism attempts to cope. So this is when you start to think about your resources. What do you have? Maybe if it's a physical threat, then you gather, your bug out bag, things like that. You're coping and attending to the threat that you're experiencing. And the third part is exhaustion. So once you have attended to the threat is no longer there, all of that mobilization, all that energy you put into attending to the threat depletes your body. And so you feel exhausted, and now time is needed to actually recover from it. So here, if you look at this is an idea of there's an event that occurs, and on the y-axis is your ability to cope. So in stage one, that dotted line is just homeostasis, right? Everything's balanced. And then you suddenly feel a threat. So the alarm reaction, what happens is it starts to increase your ability to cope. First of all, notice it goes down. Depending on the event that you're dealing with, you could feel like, oh my gosh, how am I going to deal with this? And so you're feeling that your ability to cope might go down initially, but then you start to gather your resources, maybe talk to people who help build up your ability, you're feeling that you can attend to the stressor, and it goes up. So stage two, as you can see, the resistance component, that's when you're at your peak. You have all your cognitive and physical and emotional components working together to deal with this stressful situation. The longer you keep that up, though, the more exhausted you're going to be at the end. So there are socio-emotional factors that play into stress. So if you have a type A personality, type A people tend to be very competitive. You don't have a lot of patience for others, may be very irritable. They're the ones who are like, oh my gosh, we're going to be late, we're going to be late, and get, really freaked out about it. People like this, who have type A, tend to have experience higher levels of stress and tend to have more negative outcomes physiologically. So when we look at this, your immune system, when you galvanize yourself to deal with stressors, it's at a cost, right? Energy is a zero-sum game. We only have so much energy, and if we are putting all our energy to addressing stressor, then our other parts of our body could actually be neglected or harmed. So here on the y-axis, duration of life stressor. So this is in months. So sometimes there are events that only happen for a few minutes, like being caught in traffic, right? So that's very low. As you experience a stress, such as an illness that goes on for months and months, then that is when it becomes really increases your likelihood of getting sick. So on the left side, relative risk of a cold. One indicates normal risk of getting a cold. And then, so as you can see, the longer people experience stress, the higher the probability that they'll get a cold or some other viral infection, because it depletes the energy in their immune system. So here we have, stress has been shown to put people at high risk for heart attacks as well. These are, on the left in blue, are the factors that could impact how people deal with stress. So if someone experiences a catastrophe or a major life event, as I mentioned, could be even something good. A move is very stressful. Hassles are the daily, the little irritations that we experience, such as being caught in traffic or suddenly getting, a last minute request for a deadline that's looming, those kind of things. And having a type A personality, believe it or not, is a risk factor too. If you have these, you experience stress. If you typically have unhealthy behaviors to begin with, that's going to also exacerbate the chance of you getting a heart attack. Physiological reactions. So are you the type of person who tends to have their heart beating, a lot? Do they feel really tense? All these components that the natural reactions that people have towards stress also plays a role into whether or not they're likely to get a heart attack. So what are some kind of long-term consequences of being under a lot of stress for extended periods of time? Well, you could experience weight problems. So people who are in very stressful jobs, excuse me, might also have more likely to experience type 2 diabetes. And stress can actually make it more likely for you to experience cancer. So when you have a lot of stress, it depresses your ability to fight off those overgrowing cells that are typical of cancers. And here are some other psychophysiological disorders that occur if people are in high stress situations for extended periods of time. So it's quite a lot. Cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, respiratory, musculoskeletal, and skin. So people can actually break out into hives because of stress or get acne. Eczema and psoriasis are also skin issues that are associated with stress. So important to keep it down as much as possible. In middle adulthood, a lot of times we're caregivers, right? So, and most of the caregivers are female. It creates a lot of stress in that situation, can affect people's mental and physical health. If they're caregivers, for a parent, for example, a lot of times that will create issues of social isolation. Could create financial problems, which is another aspect of stress that can happen. So it's important to recognize, especially if you know somebody or if you yourself are a caregiver, that there is a stress involved that's almost like people are ashamed to admit it when they're caregivers, because they feel like, it's a noble cause to be a caregiver for someone. And so people hesitate to express when they're experiencing stress or any other negative symptoms from it. When you're undergoing stress, there are three main ways that we can cope with them. So first one is problem-focused coping. So that is when you look at the event that's causing the stress and do something to mitigate it. For example, let's say that the stressor is getting to work late on time. If you're problem focused coping, you might leave earlier so you don't have to deal with the traffic, right? So that's one component that's in your control. So you're thinking about what causes me to get late. It is the traffic pattern. Then the way I'm going to address it is I'm going to go to work earlier. End of story. So you solve that problem. So ideally, you want to do that as much as you can. The problem is sometimes it's out of our control, right? So the problem, the stressor could be something that we can't change. Let's say that the issue is going to work late. You can't leave earlier because you have to drop off your kids to school first. So you're going to have this traffic. Well, then if you can't deal with the problem directly, then we go back to emotion-focused coping. So emotion-focused coping is when you think about the emotions, the feelings that you have when you're stressed out. If you can't do anything about the traffic, well, then instead of sitting in traffic, stewing about it, about all the time you're wasting, why don't you use the time to listen to your favorite podcast or your favorite songs, or call somebody you care about and you can talk to them while you're sitting in traffic. So these are considered emotion focused because you're not changing the event that causes the stress. What you're changing is your reaction to it. And then the third way that we can address stressful situations is what we call biofeedback. So maybe you are aware, you become aware, our watches can tell us when our heart rate is going up or things like that. So biofeedback would be you use that information that you might not be aware of, the physiological information, and address it. So maybe you start using breathing techniques to slow down your heart rate, to make you feel more relaxed, those kind of components. So you can look at it as these are three ways. Look at the problem, if it's something that you can address and control yourself. If you can't address and control the problem, then you look at your emotions, which are in your control, and you try to make it in a way that's more positive. And then you can also work on the physiological symptoms of stress to calm everything down. So now let's shift gears. Now, in terms of the Erikson's stages that we've been looking at, now we're in the stage of generativity versus stagnation. So the whole idea of middle adulthood is that now you're at a point where maybe you have, you're halfway through your life where you feel like looking back on the things that you've been able to accomplish, are you satisfied with it, right? That's the idea. You still have time. You're still young enough to pursue different goals. So the generativity versus stagnation is your decision to actually be creative, to be proactive and productive in the time you have remaining. So this is when people think back, like, what kind of legacy am I going to leave with my family, with my work, with my friends? So a lot of times what we're thinking about are our relationships. So the generativity versus stagnation, being generative is generating, is being productive still. If you don't feel like you're able to continue to contribute to your life, to the lives of people you care about, then you might have that feeling of stagnation, which is highly associated with depression and those kind of symptoms. What's interesting about middle adulthood is being part of what we call the sandwich generation. So sandwich generation are those who have to care for their aging parents, but still have younger children to care for themselves. So the sandwich, you're in the middle, right? The ends are parents, and the other side are kids, and then people in middle adulthood tend to be in the middle. And so about close to 50% of middle-aged adults feel this stress. It is very stressful. It's associated with feeling rushed. There's also a financial strain, especially if you're helping to support your parents as well. That could be a major component. In terms of relationships, because of being in that sandwich component, oftentimes people in middle adulthood are the connectors in their family. So they keep their family connected. Maybe they're the ones who organize the gatherings. For example, when COVID hit, I was the one who organized weekly Zoom meetings with my parents and my siblings so that we would connect every week. Oftentimes people in middle adulthood who will start looking at the genealogy and take on that role of keeping track of the family history, archiving important information. Again, it works with that idea of generativity and stagnation. They often play the role of advisor to their parents who are getting older, and also to their children and to their friends. So it can be stressful, but a lot of times having these successful relationships are a source of pleasure for people in middle adulthood. So kin keeping is that idea that you're the connector in your families. If your kids are older, middle adults might experience what we call the empty nest syndrome. So that's when the children leave, go off to college or maybe get jobs and they want to live on their own. In the Bay Area, this happens much later because the cost of living is so expensive. But so empty nest syndrome, sometimes people feel distress. They no longer have their kids living with them. And so there is an adjustment that has to be made. We do have some cultural differences. So in mainstream American culture, it's a relief for parents. Sometimes they look forward to it. It's like, oh, don't need to worry about our kids anymore. On the other hand, for other cultures, it is expected that kids stay until they're ready to get married, or they have to move, right? There are many cultures where it's expected that kids will stay with the parents until it's absolutely necessary for them to leave. And it's important because, in culturally speaking, you have more people who are of working age who are working. It actually creates a lot more financial stability in the situation. And also, if kids, even when children are married and have kids, if they have a multi-generational household, that also helps with caregiving. So boomerang kids are the phrase that we use for young adults who go off to college, go working, and then for some reason have to move back home. That's why it's called a boomerang, right? They go out and they come back. So about 39% of adults age 18 to 34 actually find themselves coming back home to live with their parents. A lot of times it's financial. It could be mental health issues where they just need that emotional support. So it's important to know that this boomerang kid idea is when the parents are the ones who are financially more stable. They're the ones who are paying, for example, for the home or the apartment, and the kids come back to them to help. This is not the same as parents going to live with their adult children and their adult children taking care of them. So just important to make that difference. Oops. Okay. So this is just a little graph of how many adult children are living with parents. This changes. As I mentioned, here in the Bay Area, it's much more prevalent, and the stigma of it has really gone down as well. It's just an acknowledgement when you live in an area that is very expensive, that this is going to be a way to cope with those expenses. So in middle adulthood, there are a lot of people who experience divorce, right? And so singlehood and dating is very common in middle adulthood. You even have dating sites that are specifically targeted to people who are middle-aged. What do we find? Psychologically, single adults don't seem to be worse off than their married adults, as long as they have rich friendships and a lot of social interaction, right? So why would people date? Companionship, maybe romantic activities, or sexual fulfillment. About 48% of adults in middle adulthood are still married, hopefully happily married, right? Because marital satisfaction tends to increase when you're in middle adulthood. Children tend to leave home. You're in a better position financially. Usually you're much happier in your work. And it could just be that, unfortunately, some people stay married because it's easier to stay married than to go through a divorce, because divorces are extremely expensive. Depends also on your state. In California, it's no-fault divorce, so it's 50-50 down the middle, unless you have a prenuptial agreement. So about a quarter of people who are middle-aged get divorced. More are women than men. And a lot of times what we see is that women, the more educated women are, the higher their their status in terms of jobs, the less likely they want to stay in a bad marriage. And so that's why you see a greater percentage of women divorced than men. So most divorces occur in the first 5 to 10 years of marriage. And really, the younger people are when they get married, the higher the likelihood that they will get divorced. So it's not so important. Post-divorce, a lot of times once people get divorced, they start dating within a year. It is recommended that at least 6 months after a major ending of a major relationship, you want to wait at least 6 months to gather yourself together. So more than, after a year, I think it's pretty good in terms of being in a place emotionally to be ready to share yourself again. So if you have kids, that complicates dating, especially adult children, right? You want to, so they might play the role of gatekeeping, where they want to, kids want to know who they're dating, and they're going to be very careful and selective about who they introduce to the family, which is completely understandable. Remarriage tends to go down, in middle age, but adults over 55, remarriage is more common. A lot of times, men will be the ones to remarry. You might have that stereotype of men not knowing how to take care of themselves, that kind of idea. Also, racially, there are differences where people who are Caucasian are more likely than other ethnic racial groups to remarry. And it's also important to keep in mind that there are also family dynamics to keep in mind when you talk about remarriage. So here's sort of a little graph about the marriage prevalence. As you can see, age 55 to 64, it's a much higher percent who get married. So in middle adulthood, people might become grandparents, right? Depending on how old their children are. Important to know 3 types of grandparents. There's remote, companionate, and involved. So remote grandparents, which comprise about 30%, they don't live near their kids. So this is when kids have grown far, moved away, and they have their families. And so remote parents tend to just come and visit. So they maybe come for Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever religious holiday or special occasion. They might come only in those times. Companionate grandparents are the ones who tend to live nearby. And they're called companionate because maybe they babysit once in a while. They tend to be the fun grandparents where it's just positive activities with the grandchildren. So they do things with the grandchild, but don't really try to control them or have any authority over them. Then you have the involved grandparents. So these are the ones who probably are the primary people that the parents go to. Maybe the kids go to their houses after school. So they are involved because they see their grandchildren on a regular basis. And they're very active. So not only do they do the fun stuff, but they also make sure the kids get their homework done, maybe even engage in some discipline. So how involved grandparents are is cultural, right? And how much the parents are willing to share the responsibility of raising their kids with their parents, very much culturally defined. Outside of family relationships, okay, it's also important to think about friendships. So friendships are really important at every stage of our lives. In middle adulthood, if you're experiencing transitions in terms of your life partner, then friendships play a huge role in helping to mitigate some of the stress and the depression or sadness people might experience. So people who have a lot of friendships have an increased sense of belonging and security. They have less depression and anxiety. They tend to deal with stressors more easily because they know they have a support group. So if somebody doesn't have a lot of friends, which tends to be more men than females, unfortunately, usually they experience depression more. So poor social connectedness, you have a larger risk of premature mortality. And it actually impacts that mortality more than smoking, more than obesity, more than alcoholism. So feeling like you have no one to turn to actually plays a huge role in your overall physical and emotional well-being. So female friendships tend to be associated with a lot more support. They have confidants, people they can talk to with their secrets, and that's important for your mental health. Sometimes it's hard to maintain these friendships because of all the responsibilities. So you have to really carve out that time to develop and maintain those important friendships. Male friendships, what are some patterns? They see it involved with sharing alcohol. Remember, male friendships tend to be activity-based. So if men are doing sports like golf or something like that, that tends to build a lot of their friendships. And, kind of friendships that you develop in young adulthood, oftentimes it goes into your middle and late adulthood. So in terms of internet and workplace friendships, there's an anonymity that is involved with internet relationships that can make people feel like it's easier to share secrets and things. Be very careful with these internet relationships. Sometimes it's a completely different person than you think you're connecting to. What does help? Well, people who have social anxiety tend to indulge in the internet friendships more than people who don't have a problem interacting with others. People who are artistic actually can find groups. So those who have some challenges interacting face to face with others might find the internet relationships a really nice venue for connecting. Workplace friendships, a lot of friendships develop. It makes it more pleasant to work with people who you actually enjoy spending time with, right? So it makes work much easier. Having mentors in the workplace environment also helps with success. And just knowing you can count on people and knowing people who can direct you to the right resources at work also plays a role in it. Oops, okay. So in terms of women in midlife, sadly, there is a double standard, right? So a lot of times, like the stereotype is that women get old and men get more distinguished. And the idea is that, first of all, men don't lose their ability to reproduce, and men, they can stay in their jobs, their careers, usually longer than women. And so that also increases financially. They become much more attractive in that sense. Women, right? Because initially they're valued for reproductive capabilities. And so when women are middle-aged and they're no longer able to have children, sometimes in some societies and some cultures, they're seen as less valuable. So that idea that women are valued for reproduction relationship, that component, and men are valued for achievements, that creates that double standard. Fortunately, as baby boomers are getting older, and we see that women continue to be very productive and very creative and able to contribute to society and friendships long term, that stigma really has decreased a lot. In terms of getting older, again, culturally defined, it really depends. Sometimes some cultures really respect and revere the elderly, such as Japanese cultures, where people are valued for their wisdom, their ability to guide others. So older Asian women, for example, attain greater respect and have greater authority. Unfortunately, white women tend to have more stereotypes about aging, again, culturally defined. And it seems that even in terms of sexual orientation, lesbians are less negative about aging and looking older than their heterosexual counterparts. So what helps in terms of feeling, accepting that you're in middle age and going further on in later adulthood? Two interesting components: religiosity. So being involved in a religious group often helps. Again, it's kind of more the social aspect, and also just sort of the emotional understanding how certain religions approach aging and the elderly. That makes a difference. And also spirituality, just sort of that sense of connection with forces other than your own. So the focus being away from the physical component and really more about this sociological, psychological component helps to mitigate some of the negativity that happens when people experience aging. So thinking about this, overall psychosocial development, remember that midlife crisis is not as common as originally thought. It's actually a stereotype that was generated in the late 70s, but is not empirically supported. We talked about stress, how to cope with stress, what causes stress. It's important to know that Seeley's general adaptation syndrome also. In terms of Erickson, we're in the psychosocial task of generativity versus stagnation. In middle adulthood, we start to look back on our lives and, decide, are we satisfied with the legacy that we're going to leave? If we're not, let's be generative and continue to build those relationships and continue to be productive. On the other hand, some people might feel depressed that, oh my goodness, half my life is gone and I haven't done anything with it. So that's really depends on how people want to approach this stage in their lives. Many relationship changes in middle adulthood. In the sandwich generation, the kin keeping, grandparenthood, those kind of ideas. In terms of romantic relationships, singlehood, marriage, divorce, remarriage, that becomes plays into this stage, unfortunately, often. Roles of grandparents, friendships at middle life. What are the challenges that are unique to women at this stage? And also the role of religion. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop the recording.